On a Bible binge for the last 12 months. We're working our way into month number 13 here on this Bible binge, making our way from Genesis to Revelation. And it's really a Bible reading plan. So we've been helping ourselves understand the Bible a little better as we read it. And so our sermons on Sundays have been wherever we happen to be in the Bible binge. That's where the sermons on Sunday have been for the past 12 months. Yesterday we were in Jonah, and I thought we would talk a little bit about something else that's going on in Jonah. We didn't talk about it in the sermon, didn't talk about it last week during our conversations at the table, but I thought it would be good for us just for a brief moment this Thanksgiving week to think about this. And that's this. If you think about Jonah, the story of Jonah is one where he is a prophet in Israel, and God wants him to go give the gospel to Israel's enemies. So he ends up going not to Nineveh. He was supposed to go to Nineveh, but he doesn't go to Nineveh. Nineveh is just north of Israel. He ends up going to the west. He goes as far away as he can. And instead of going to Nineveh, he ends up on a boat. And he's running away from the presence of the Lord. We find that out in Jonah chapter 1. And Jonah figures out quickly that God's presence, the presence he's been running from, follows him onto the boat, follows him into the sea. And before you know it, there's a storm. And Jonah tells the sailors on the boat, hey, throw me overboard and the storm will be over. And he's right. They throw him overboard. The storm ends. And he gets swallowed by a big fish. Jonah chapter 2 is a prayer that he prays while he's in the belly of the fish at the bottom of the Mediterranean. And eventually Jonah gets spit up back on the beach. And this time he goes to Nineveh. Again, Israel's enemies. And by enemies, these are people that are not Jewish. They're not Hebrew. They are Gentiles. He goes and spends one day in Nineveh, the city, and the entire place, big revival. They all embrace the gospel. And that's a super short version of what happens in Jonah. Jonah doesn't want to go. He ends up in a fish. And then he finally does go. And the very people that he was sent to go in the first place, he goes, he preaches the gospel, preaches judgment and salvation, and they embrace the gospel. And God does not bring the disaster that he promised that he was going to send them. That's Jonah. Hundreds of years later, Jesus and his disciples are having a conversation with the religious leaders of that day, as well as the crowd that was around them. And here's the conversation as Matthew records it. This is very interesting. Some of the scribes and Pharisees said to Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." We talked about this yesterday. And Jesus answers them, "An evil and adulterous generation demands a sign, but no sign is going to be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the huge fish 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at Jonah's preaching. And look, something greater than Jonah is here." Now, obviously, Jesus is talking about himself when he says something greater. Actually, someone greater than Jonah is here. Jesus is the new Jonah, and he's chiding the religious leaders and the crowd that they're not believing, they're not repenting like Nineveh did. In fact, Nineveh is going to stand up at Judgment Day and be a witness against them because Nineveh did what they haven't. All right? So, that is Christ's conversation, but what's going on in that conversation is he's also being very offensive. Go figure. What Jesus has to say is offensive because Nineveh, those are Gentiles. And what Jesus is saying is the Gentiles actually are doing something better than you are doing, Israel. And so Jesus, again, is reading the book of Jonah, and this is something that we're supposed to pick up on in the story of Jonah. And some have written about this, but we're going to talk about this a little bit. Jonah has something else going on in his book that we need to see. And Jesus is picking up on it when he has this conversation. The opening line of Jonah is, "Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because their evil has come up before me." So what God is saying is, go to Nineveh, go to your enemies, Assyria, the ones that 150 years later will come and conquer Israel, but go to your enemies. Those enemies are Gentiles. Go to the Gentiles with a message of judgment and salvation. You see, the gospel isn't just for the Jews. The gospel is for the Gentiles. The gospel is for the whole world. And so Jonah doesn't. Jonah's interested in making sure that the gospel and the message of salvation, the good news of the promise, is just kept within the boundaries of Israel. He's going to bottle it all up. In fact, Israel's been doing this. Israel was notorious for hundreds of years. They really hadn't taken this message of the good news of the promise to the nations. And it was just for them. And they got to thinking, well, it's just us. And certainly the religious leaders of Jesus' day, the pastors of those congregations, and Jesus is saying, you're this. You're trying to bottle everything up. You're trying to keep the message for yourself. You're trying to keep the good news for yourself. You think you're okay. No, this is for the Gentiles. And so what Jonah doesn't know is that God is insisting that he take the good news to the whole world. In fact, Jonah is given a very definitive lesson on this. We're going to see this in a second. Because when Jonah gets on that boat, Jonah's getting on a boat that's full of Gentiles. And before it's over, the gospel is going to be embraced by those sailors. It's going to be embraced by the guys that are on the boat. Before the storm ends, they're already giving thanks and praise to the one true God of Israel. They've embraced the promise. They're doing what Israel hasn't. And they're doing what Jonah isn't. So that's the first message, the first ping God gives Jonah is, hey, look, this isn't to be bottled up in Israel. This is for the whole world. Those sailors, the pagan sailors, the Gentile sailors, embrace the gospel. Then, after Jonah's in the fish, he goes to Nineveh. Same thing happens. The city of Nineveh acts like the sailors. The city of Nineveh is embracing the gospel. They're embracing the good news of the promise. God's salvation and judgment is what they're embracing. And so this is the story of Jonah, that Jonah's a story of mission. A mission that is for the world. It's not just for the Jews. This shows up again in the New Testament. It's not just Jesus in this conversation. There's one more place where this shows up. It's in the book of Acts. And it's a story of Peter. When Jesus left to go into heaven to be with his Father, he has this conversation with his disciples, his last conversation, and he says, you're going to be my witnesses, and I'm going to use you to take the gospel from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. That doesn't happen right away. In Acts 10, we go into the story of Acts, and we get to Acts 10, and we realize, you know what? The gospel really hasn't gone beyond Jerusalem. How is Jesus going to make good on his promise? Well, he does make good on his promise, and he's going to do it through Peter. And so this is what Acts 10, the opening lines of Acts 10. I'm going to read you some sentences here, but there's some things here that should kind of just jump out at us. There was a man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment. So he's a soldier. He's a military officer. He was a devout man and feared God along with his whole household. He did many charitable deeds for the Jewish people and always prayed to God. About 3 p.m, he distinctly saw in a vision an angel of God who came to him and said to him, Cornelius. Staring at him in awe, he said, What is it, Lord? And the angel told him, Your prayers and your acts of charity have ascended as a memorial offering before God. Now, and here's where this is going. Now, send men to Joppa and call for Simon, who's Peter. He's lodging with another Simon who is a tanner, whose house is by the sea. You see, Jonah fled to Joppa. And so anyone who is hearing this, hearing the words Joppa and a house by the sea, immediately they start thinking, oh, here's a Jonah story. That's exactly right. Only this time, Peter is not running to Joppa. He's going to be pulled from Joppa. But the mission is the same. Cornelius is a Gentile. And the gospel is to go to the Gentiles. And so Peter comes from Joppa. He preaches the good news of Jesus to Cornelius and his family and his friends, and the gospel explodes from there. The gospel is going to the Gentiles from Joppa. The very place that Jonah fled to now becomes the hub and becomes the source point for mission, for the good news, to go to the whole world. So you can't read Jonah without understanding this sense of mission, that the gospel isn't just for us. And we can act like that sometimes. Sometimes we can act like the gospel's ours. It's ours to hold on to, and we get to say who gets it and who doesn't. And remember, we said last week, one of the key verses in Jonah is salvation belongs to the Lord. It doesn't belong to me. Didn't belong to Jonah. It belongs to Jesus. And Jesus is going to make sure that the whole world hears the good news. He's using us. And so it's not ours to keep. It's not ours to hold on to. But it's ours to give to whoever. There are people around us in our, what I saw, our spheres, our circles of influence, whether it's our family or friends, and they need to know, they need to hear the good news. They need to hear about the promise. They need to hear that Jesus is forgiving. In fact, that's the story. Remember, Jonah says, I didn't want to go to Nineveh because I knew that you're a God who is compassionate and gracious and slow to anger. Nineveh finds that out. Cornelius finds that out. We've found that out. We know that. There are people around us here in Los Fresnos that don't know that. They need to hear it. In fact, I need to hear it. We need to hear this all the time. So, Jonah's a story about mission. Jonah's a story about how the good news is not ours. The good news is everybody's. And so the forgiveness and the compassion that we receive become forgiveness and compassion for others. And so there are going to be moments all this week, probably even at the Thanksgiving table, there's going to be moments all this week where we have an opportunity to either act in compassion or kindness, or even say something that is grace-filled, full of compassion. We have an opportunity to forgive. There are all sorts of things happening where the gospel that we receive becomes the gospel for others. And we have a chance to do that. More Jesus in more places. More Jesus where we live, learn, work, and play. That is the story of Jonah. Jonah is the story of the gospel for the whole world. Jonah is the story of the gospel for me, the gospel for you, the gospel for Los Fresnos. So that's our conversation at the table. I hope you're having a great Monday. I hope you have a great rest of the week. We'll be back again tomorrow with another conversation at the table. Until then, just remember this, even this evening, that you can rest well knowing that Jesus has you. He promised. Have a good evening.